Okay, so to begin our foray into audition, which is sound, I want to piggyback off of vision a little bit because there's a good visual representation of how the thalamus is involved in the sensory process that I think will help you. Okay, so once you understand the process of transduction and understand how energies get converted into pulses and they get carried to the cortex of the brain, then it's a pretty easy thing to just apply that to all the other senses. So, let me clean that up by saying this. Let's look at vision, the process of interpreting vision, visual data, as the model for all of sensation. Right? We talked about top-down processing and bottom-up processing and sensation versus perception. Right? So let's talk about how the process works. Here's what you know. You know that the only way that you experience the world is through the vibrations that are in the air around your body, right? So your brain doesn't see anything. Your brain doesn't hear anything. No, your brain understands encoded data. And there's a reason why. Because if you think about this logically, you've probably never thought about it. Why does your brain need eyeballs? Why can't the brain just see? Well, the reason why is because sometimes your brain doesn't want to see. Sometimes your brain wants to go to sleep. It wants to rest. It wants to charge. It wants to spend its energy doing something else. So your brain depends very heavily on sensory receptors that are all around your body. And the purpose of sensory receptors is to gather vibrations from the air. That's what they do. Your eyeballs gather light vibrations. Your eardrums gather sound vibrations. Your skin cells gather pressure vibrations. Right? You have tactile pathways and visual pathways and auditory pathways. Your brain relies on the collection of vibrations to create a perception of reality. And it's important that your brain does that because it doesn't always want to see. It doesn't always want to hear. It doesn't always want to feel. So the brain can decide, being consciously awake and alert, when it's time to recognize sight data and when it's not. That's how you can close your eyes and rest and go to sleep. So, you know that there is sensation and that is different from perception. Perception is what does your brain do with this coded data that it's getting from the senses. But the sensation part is simple. People overcomplicate it on tests. Sensation is nothing more than collecting. That's all it is. It's collecting stimulus energies from the air. What do your eyeballs do? All they do is collect vibrations. They absorb them. So the sensory receptors in your eye are the retina, essentially. That's too far. The retina. And what does the retina do? It absorbs light waves. But your brain doesn't understand light waves. Your brain understands the encoded messages that go from neuron to neuron through synapses. Your brain communicates electrochemically. So something has to happen. It's almost like the photoreceptor cells in a plant or in like a solar panel, right? Your eyeball absorbs the light waves, but then it has to convert them. That's called transduction. Why? Because your brain doesn't speak light wave. Your brain doesn't register vibrations. It can't perceive vibrations at all. So the eyeball has to convert light waves into a vibration, a pulse, let's say, that your brain can make sense of. It's like me yelling at my computer over there. Hey, computer, turn on. Well, I'm giving it a command. It should understand my command. It's a simple command. It's a computer. The computer should be smart enough to understand my command. It's not the problem. It's not that it can't understand what I'm telling it to do. It's that it can't hear me. That's how your brain is limited in access. It needs code, right? Way back in chapter 7, the word encoding. What encoding means is taking something from the air and converting it into a pulse, right? Getting it into your brain. That's what encoding means. So, yeah, we talk about memories and stuff like that, but what is a memory? A memory is perception. It can be seconds, right? Your brain has to recognize something and then decide if it wants to keep it and pay attention to it or throw it away. So, in order to encode something, it has to be converted from the vibration that it exists as in the air into a pulse that the brain can make sense of. So, at some point, we have to collect the data, we have to transfer the data, we have to deliver the data, and then we have to make sense of the data or perceive the data. So we go from the receptor cells to the nerve cell network that brings them to their place, to the thalamus in the brainstem, which routes it to the surface of the brain, and then it gets perceived, right? So in the case of sight, the eyeballs, the retina specifically, are absorbing the light waves. The bipolar and ganglion cells that make up the optic nerve, that's where transduction occurs. It converts a light wave into a pulse. That pulse travels down the optic nerve until it gets to the thalamus, because we know that the thalamus is in charge of routing sensory data. And the thalamus says, I recognize this code. I know what this is. This is a sight. And so the thalamus sends the encoded sight message to the visual cortex of the brain. That's what it does. And the visual cortex of the brain is in the occipital lobe, and that's how you perceive sight. The same thing happens with sound, right? What does the eardrum do? The eardrum collects sound vibrations, travels it down the auditory nerve to the thalamus. The thalamus says, I know what that is. That's a sound. And it sends that sound message to the auditory cortex in the temporal lobe. So this is a very involved process. It's actually pretty fascinating, right? Eyeball to optic nerve to thalamus to visual cortex, which is in the back of your brain. Now, once it goes to the visual cortex, and you can see that you have a right visual field and you have a left visual field, and they go to opposite hemispheres, right? But you have a right visual field in your right eye, which is black, and then you have a right visual field in your left eye. And so it's really kind of interesting. But once it gets to your visual cortex, what's taking place? Well, now you need the recognition of colors and shapes and objects. And so deep inside of the circuits of your visual cortex, you have these pathways and receptors that are called feature detectors. And what feature detectors do, it's a very literal term, all they do is recognize objects. That's what feature detectors do. So through the magic of PET scans, we can see things like specific parts of the brain, right? So there's some review here with the PET scan that actually is pretty fascinating to understand, this whole homeostatic process. So in the food that you eat, right, this is going back to chapter 3, in the food that you eat, you're putting nutrients into your bloodstream. Well, the nutrients in your bloodstream are going to go into the temporal artery, which runs through the middle tissue of your brain, and any of those nutrients that leak through the blood-brain barrier will get into the glial cells of your brain. Because what are glial cells? Those are the fatty white tissue that nourish, build, metabolize, carry off dead, right, and bring nutrition to your neurons, right? The gray matter is the cell bodies of the neurons, the axons, right? But what is the white matter? The white matter of your brain is that fatty tissue that's in the middle. It's glial cells. It's things like myelin. Myelin is fatty tissue, is white tissue. It's a form of glial cell. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is because this will help you understand how a PET scan works. So a PET scan will tell us the most out of any brain scan. But it's invasive, and it's dangerous, and it's kind of expensive. And so it's not the most common type of brain scan, but it is the most, let's say, well, pardon the pun, it's the most illuminating, it's the most educational, right, telling of all the brain scans. And here's why. One of the nutrients that your brain relies on heavily is glucose, right? In fact, we know that your brain metabolizes about 25% of all the calories that you eat in any given day. And probably the strongest thing that your brain needs for development is DHA. And DHA is a chemical compound that comes from one natural source. The highest concentration of DHA known to man on the human planet is from the fat of red meat. That's where DHA comes from. It is built genetically into your code that your brain develops when you eat red meat. Specifically the fat in red meat. The protein obviously helps your muscles and helps you regenerate your cells. But DHA is necessary for glial cells in your brain. And you might say, I'm a vegan. Well, that's a problem. Well, it's not a problem because it's 2021. If it was 1872, that would be a problem. No, if you're a vegan, you're actually not really completely fitting in with your biology because your ancient chemistry and biology evolutionarily is built for you to operate on a omnivorous diet. In fact, it's actually probably safer for you to only eat meat. Never eat fruits or any vegetables. And you're like, well, that doesn't seem true. But it is. If you were, say, like a Lakota Sioux, and you lived in the 1880s in the Great Plains, what do you eat? You eat buffalo and occasionally some nuts. Well, why? Because the meat that you're consuming eats a balanced diet of vegetation, and that's where you get your nutrients from vegetation. So in 2021, yeah, it's probably not possible for you to only eat meat without supplementing, because the meat that you're eating is not complete in its balanced diet. It's not out there grazing in your backyard and getting all the enzymes from the soil and all the vitamins and minerals that you need. No, you're still going to have to supplement with vegetables and fruits and things like that. Well, really, you probably don't even need fruits, mainly vegetables, right? But it's possible to eat a balanced diet eating nothing but meat, right? It's kind of crazy to think about. You have these Netflix documentaries and all these places that say, is it even necessary to eat meat at all? That's literally the opposite of the truth. It's actually more necessary to eat meat than it is to eat anything else. So if you're a vegan, you're like, what does that mean for me? Well, okay, again, you live in a developed society. You can supplement your diet with the synthetic forms of those nutrients and those compounds that you're supposed to get from eating meat. Because the reality is, you're also not a nomadic people, right? To be completely fair, it's problematic for you to eat nothing but meat because your cholesterol will be through the roof. You don't walk 20 miles a day like your ancestors did, right? You may not walk a mile a day, right? You probably don't walk a single mile. So the reality is that you can't just pick and choose from your evolutionary biology. You would have to live the entire lifestyle of your ancient ancestors in order for that to be the case. And so you'd have to have a balanced diet, and you'd have to get enough cardiovascular exercise that your cholesterol wouldn't be through the roof. But the reality is this: one of those things that glial cells do are bring nourishment to your neurons. So the reason why I bring that up in a conversation about transduction is this. When we look at a PET scan, what is it that it's actually telling us? Why is it valuable to know where glucose is in the brain? Well, because where glucose is being metabolized in the brain is where the neurons are firing. So for instance, if you were to imagine, how would we know the specific real estate in the visual cortex where feature detectors exist? Well, from fMRIs and from PET scans. So what a PET scan will tell us is that if we have radioactive glucose coursing through your veins, and you're looking at, say, a chair, which is represented by the blue region here, then we know that that's the specific part of your visual cortex where those feature detectors that do nothing but recognize the shape and dimension and outline of chairs. It's all firing. Look at the red, faces. This is kind of unique. You see, right, specific cortex area that's not even connected, right? It's this real estate is separate from one another. So for whatever reason, that's the part of the brain that's active, the feature detectors, when you're recognizing faces. So it's a very involved, complex process. It involves sensory reception, it involves transduction, it involves delivery, it involves routing from the thalamus, and it involves recognition once it gets there. That's what your feature detectors in the visual cortex do. They recognize objects, and your brain stores that. Believe it or not, you actually have memory circuits in your visual cortex, because if not, it would be like you saw a chair for the first time ever, right? So why are your memory systems so much more complex than other mammals? Because other mammals don't have to rely on memory and knowledge and cognition. No, they rely on what? It starts with an I. They rely on their instincts, right? And so your cat doesn't need to memorize everything in their cortex pathways, because they're going to rely on their instincts to determine if they're in danger or not, right? A dog, on the other hand, that's a cooperative animal. So a dog might walk up to something that's potentially a predator just out of blind trust. That's not evolutionarily sound. In fact, when you look at the difference between cats and dogs, which we've talked about extensively, there's really only one species of cat known in the animal kingdom that actually is a cooperative species of cat. You know which large cat is a pack cat animal? They exist in prides, right? Nobody? Lions. Yeah, lions are the only species of wild cat or big cat that are actually cooperative, collaborative social structures that are complex, right? There are families and biological units and tigers and bobcats and these other predatory cats, but they're largely self-sufficient. They don't exist in a complex social structure, whereas the canine species does, right? Bears and wolves and dogs and things like that. All of that has to do with homeostasis, but it also has to do with visual, auditory, and instinctive circuits in the brain. The reason why you remember more things than other animals do is because you don't have to depend on instincts like other animals do. So your memory networks are very complex. You have memory networks in your visual cortex. So not only do you recognize that object and know that that object is different than another object, you know that that's a chair because you've seen one before, right? And that's what Piaget was studying. He's studying how do these developmental changes happen in the brain over time, right? How do children build schemas? And then how do they try to assimilate schemas based on things they already know? And sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes they have to accommodate, right? So now it's all connecting, right? It's all coming together. And we look even deeper at the visual process. The visual cortex and feature detectors are doing really complex parallel processes all at the same time, right? Because not only do you recognize that's an object, because it looks different than the rest of the space that it's in, it has a color to it. So you have feature detectors in your visual cortex that recognize color. You have other feature detectors that recognize that object appears to be in motion, and it's traveling at X rate of speed across the plane that I'm looking at, right? Not only that, you have different feature detectors in your visual cortex that recognize the form and the outline or shape of this item, and even the depth and the dimension. So all of these binocular cues and monocular cues, all of these things come together in your brain to form the reality that you exist in. And the most fascinating part is all of these complex parallel processes are happening instantaneously every second that you're awake. It requires a lot of brain power, and we take it for granted. It's really, really, really actually fascinating stuff. So when you understand one sensory process, one perceptive process, I should say, it's the same for all of them. Vision is the same as hearing, right? Because what happens? You have receptacles, these big radar things that do nothing but collect, right? Sensory receptors. Then they convert, transduction. Then they deliver down the auditory nerve. Surprise, surprise, it goes to the thalamus. Then the thalamus routes it to the surface of the brain where the brain makes sense of it. But instead of recognizing shape and color and size and dimension, you recognize pitch and tone and melody and things like that, right? So it's a sensation, conversion, perception process, right? It's really pretty fascinating. So let's skip through the rest of visual because we did talk about the color theories and we talked about the after image effect, right? We talked about things like that. Let's get into hearing because now the process is the same thing, right? We don't need to go into the same detail. We'll just give the examples or fill in the blanks. So if vision is the ocular process, right? Hearing is the auditory process. It's not the visual process. So it's known as audition. It's not vision, it's audition, right? So you have vision, you have audition, you have haptic touch, right? So the ability to manipulate things. You have taste and you have smell. And the unique thing about smell is the only one of your five senses that doesn't have to go through the thalamus. It doesn't have to have transduction. It doesn't have to be converted because it's a chemical, right? So smell is just odor that's in the air. Imagine little tiny odor molecules. So when those odor molecules enter into your nose, you have the mucous membranes, you have the olfactory bulb. So if those odor molecules float into your nose either detects them or it does not, right? It's a chemical system in your brain. So you can't really fool the nose, right? It either detects an odor or it does not. So it either reaches the minimum threshold for smell or it doesn't. But sound, sight, you can fool all of those because it's a multi-step process, right? The nose does not involve the thalamus. In fact, it doesn't involve the memory cortexes. It doesn't involve the circuitry that your other senses do. So when you get dementia, if you live long enough, your neurons start to break down, right? You get Alzheimer's or dementia, you start to lose memories and vision and sight, but not your sense of smell because that's chemical. It's either firing or it isn't. Now, you can damage your sense of smell, obviously, or you can lose it, right? But it's either happening or it's not. So let's get into audition. Now, if light waves are, measured in wavelength and they're measured in frequency or amplitude, is this bright yellow, right? Or is it blue or an earth tone? Sound waves, they have physical properties also, right? But we're going to measure amplitude, pitch, right? And that's going to tell us, is this a high-pitched note, a low-pitched note, right? And then obviously you have tones, and they go together to make sounds, and sounds go together to make melodies or words or tones or things that you recognize. So the frequency of the wave is going to tell you the pitch, right? The amplitude of the wave is going to tell you like the intensity of it, the decibel. So there's three parts to the hearing system. Right? You have the outer ear, you have the middle ear, and you have the inner ear. And it's really not as complex as it sounds, right? The outer ear is nothing but cartilage and skin, right? So what are your ears? They're like satellite dishes. What do? They do nothing but collect waves. In fact, they're barely on there. There's no like connection and neurological networks in your ears. It only takes 4 pounds of pressure to rip your ear completely off of your face. It's actually not that structurally sound. All your ear does is to concentrate sound waves into the inner ear, the ear canal, right? And different animals have different skull structures. Like so a horse is going to have an offsetting visual field so they can see 180 degrees. You don't, right? You have this like retinal disparity that's overlapping a few feet in front of your face. So if you want to see to your side, you have to turn your body around, right? Which is much easier for you to do as a human than it is for a horse to do, right? So they need to be aware of a bigger visual field than you do. Like a hammerhead shark, right? They're going to be able to see in a greater degree, right? In degrees, literally. Right, but they're going to be problematic. They're not going to be able to see below them. So the design of our structure is based on our environment, right? So the assumption here, not just with sight, but with audition, is the things that we need to hear are going to be from different directions, right? They're going to come to the side of our faces, and if we need to, we can turn and direct our attention, right? So the structure of how our sensory receptacles are set up is based on our environments, right? We are bipeds, not quadrupeds, right? So we collect data in a different way than dogs and horses. And our ears are set up differently. Our eyes are set up differently, those kinds of things. So we have the outer ear, we have the middle ear, and we have the inner ear. Now, the easiest way to simplify this, if we're talking inner ear, we're talking the actual neurological structure here. That's where transduction occurs. That's where messages are firing. That's where the brain's neurons get involved. Right? That's where the actual auditory nerve is. So inner ear damage is sensory neural. Inner ear damage is always going to be sensory neural. Right? Middle ear damage is going to be conduction. So let's dive into it. We have the auditory canal, sound waves that are in the air around you. Again, so things can create a barrier for sound waves to have to travel through, like these walls. They have somewhat insulating property to them. Sound waves don't travel as easily through the walls as they do through an open doorway. Why? Because the sound wave is an actual physical property. It's a wave. So it can bend and reflect and be muted. So if you eliminate the walls, sound waves can travel further. Sound waves obviously travel across water and all kinds of different ways that you can enhance sound. But unless you amplify the sound somehow, like with water or a speaker, there's a limit to the distance, right? And that's place theory. Like at what place is that sound wave traveling to your head and from how far away, right? So now we're talking thresholds, right? At what decibel does a sound wave have to actually be at when it hits our ear canal before your eardrum will actually register it as a sound? And think of thresholds as like a bar, right? So how high do we have to go? So the lower your threshold is for something, the more sensitive you are. So in other words, let's say that your hearing is better than my hearing. Well, what does that mean in neurological terms? Well, it means that you have a lower absolute threshold, right? So if you imagine it in your mind like the bar is lower, right? It takes less to get there. So if you have a better sense of smell than I do, then what that means is you have a lower threshold for smell, right? That's what it means. Because the higher your threshold is, the more stimulation it takes. So your grandfather probably has a much higher threshold for sound than you do. It takes a much louder decibel sound for you to hear me, Grandpa, right, than it does for you, because your threshold for sound is lower. It's more sensitive, in other words. Just like when you're younger, your taste buds are more sensitive. You have more of them. It's a higher concentration, right? So little kids don't like things. Your dad probably puts hot sauce on everything. Why? Because he's old. He can't taste anything, right? So thresholds increase with age. That's what happens. Your hearing gets worse, your vision gets worse, your sense of taste and your sense of smell get worse, right? So, and that matters because let's say, for instance, you have conduction hearing loss. Well, then we need a hearing aid situation. Why? Because you have to amplify the sound wave so that it can actually stimulate the eardrum. So that's what the ear canal is for. It's to concentrate, act as like an echo chamber for a sound wave to get into your brain. So what happens is very simple. It moves the eardrum. As the eardrum moves, the eardrum is connected by the smallest bones in your body, the 3 little bones of the middle ear. So what happens is the eardrum moves these little tiny bones, right? Here's your eardrum. And you have the middle ear, which is the 3 smallest bones in your body. You have the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, right? And they're called that because you can see it looks like the stirrup on a equestrian saddle, right? So the stirrup is connected as a hinge to the eardrum. So as the eardrum moves, it moves those bones. And those bones vibrate the cochlea, which is in the inner ear. And that cochlea is full of fluid. And so as you move the cochlea, the fluid shifts. As the fluid shifts through the basilar membrane, the little hairs, you get transduction. And what happens is a vibration has now been converted into a pulse, right? So in the eyeballs, transduction occurs in the retina. In the audition system, transduction occurs in the cochlea, right? That's where the vibrations turn into pulses. So we have the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. I don't know how important it is to know those specific bones, right? Or to know where they are. I mean, it's possible they could ask you that, but I wouldn't spend a lot of time and energy on it just because you can figure it out, right? But it is important to know the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. And the inner ear is the neurological part. That's where it gets really interesting, right? So, what if we get into, we got all that, the stirrup and the anvil. Let's get into the inner ear. The inner ear is the neurological side of audition, right? The inner ear is where the fluid-filled cochlea is stimulated. Transduction occurs, which means a wave has now been converted into a new form of energy, in this case a pulse. So, the cochlea has a fluid-filled semi-spiral membrane that's in the inner ear, right? And so when you start looking at the auditory nerve and the auditory cortex of the temporal lobe, you start looking at what sensory neural hearing loss actually looks like, right? Some people have damage to the auditory nerve. All right, when I was in college, I took sign language because it was worth more credit hours, and I didn't want to take Spanish anymore. And so I should have taken Spanish probably, but I took sign language, so I took 2 semesters of sign language. My professor in my second sign language class had sensory neural hearing loss. So he had no audition. He could not hear from birth. His auditory nerve had been damaged prior to birth or in development, so he could never hear. So he only signed, and he wrote on the board. So he was able to communicate and teach us sign, basic language that way. But it was interesting to me because he was explaining to us that the middle ear was perfectly fine. There was nothing wrong with his eardrum. So it's not anything that a hearing aid would help. He would need a cochlear implant, right, which is a surgical procedure where they would drill a hole into your skull, and they put a little electrode into the cochlea itself. And what happens is that collects the vibration, almost like an eardrum would, and sends a little electrical pulse through the cochlea. So it's really kind of fascinating how sensory neural hearing loss is corrected. So you have the cochlea, and you have what's known as the basilar membrane. And the basilar membrane is the little tiny hairs in that canal. And what happens is, as fluid is moving in one direction, it's going to stimulate the hairs. So those little tiny hairs are what help you distinguish pitches and sounds and tones and notes. So those of you that are musically inclined, that's what's happening, right? Now what's interesting about all this, if you look at the whole process as a whole, we go backwards to go forwards. If, let's say that you get a sinus infection, right? Or maybe when you were a little kid, you might have gotten a lot of ear infections. So what happens is, the neurological explanation for that is inflammation. So inflammation happens when these neurotransmitters, which are molecules called histamines, are released. So what happens is you get an allergen. Allergen meaning it causes irritation. So how your brain reacts to that, the hypothalamus detects that there's an allergen, and the hypothalamus releases histamines, or instructs the release of histamines. And the histamines concentrate, and they fight. And they fight this foreign body. But the problem is, and those of you who have allergies know this, the problem is that that takes a toll on your body. It causes your body temperature to raise, and it causes fluid to be increased, mucus membranes to be increased. So if you have allergies on a daily basis, you take something like Claritin or Zyrtec, which pharmaceutically is a what? It's an antihistamine. It actually affects the brain, not the nasal passages. It prevents the hypothalamus from releasing histamines. Why does that matter? Well, when you're a little kid, your facial structure has not fully developed. And so if you look at this eustachian tube, when the fluid builds up behind your eardrums, it doesn't drain out through gravity like it does now that you're older. So if you were little, you may have gotten so many ear infections that they actually have to put a tube in there. You can put a tube in your ear, and what it does is it allows this fluid to drain out. Because typically, this eustachian tube has a gravity flow to it, right? It would drain down and run out of your nose. But little kids, it doesn't. Their faces are short, right? Their skeletal bone structure. So their eustachian tubes are a little bit more flat. So it's kind of interesting how the whole process connects together, right? But from a hearing standpoint, just understand that the neurological side of things is the inner ear. And that if you were to get a problem with the cochlea, I'll show you an x-ray of a cochlear implant, right? So the cochlea obviously takes a vibration from the fluid, the basilar membrane, converts it into a pulse. The pulse travels down the auditory nerve, so the octave nerve, or ocular nerve, and it goes to the thalamus, and the thalamus routes it, in this case, to the auditory cortex in the brain.